Okay, so welcome everybody to today's PRISM seminar. Just a few points of business before we get started. Quick reminder to just stay on mute unless you want to ask a question. And if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute and ask. We're a fairly small group today, so I feel like it's maybe even easier to sort of have a conversation if that makes sense. But otherwise, feel free to hold more substantive questions to the end or type questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to ask them on your behalf. And I think that's it. So let's get started. So we're delighted today to welcome Professor Magdalena Bennett. Magdalena is an assistant professor in the stats group in the IROM department at the McComb School of Business at UT Austin and a research affiliate at Learning Collider and the Population Research Center at UT Austin. Her research interests relate to developing and enhancing statistical methods for causal inference in observational and experimental studies. She also focuses on relevant policy questions in education, such as socioeconomic segregation and school choice. Magdalena, we're delighted to have you here. Please feel free to share your slides and take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Great. Assuming everything looks good. So yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be presenting this work here today. This is joint work actually with Chris Nielsen, who's a professor at Yale, and with Nico Rojas, who's an outstanding PhD candidate at Columbia. And today I'm going to be talking about high-stake testing and the effect on attendance of the day of the test. So just to start motivating this project overall, we need to think about the fact that high-stake testing is really widely used in education policy for a variety of different decisions. So you can think that funding decisions a lot of the times are tied to performance from schools. Also, teachers' promotions a lot of the times also have to do with how well students are progressing, for example. And even if we keep schools open, a lot of the times, depending on the setting, has to do with how they do on these sort of tests. From the demand side, it's also very important. High stakes tests are also very relevant because there are a lot of the times the main input that parents have in order to decide where to send their kids to school. So we use them for a variety of different reasons. And of course, this is also under the assumption that standardized tests somewhat are a proxy of school quality. I'm not going to fully open that can of worms here, but clearly there's a variety of reasons why that's not necessarily the case. So for example, we might be concerned about things like teaching to the test or even explicit teaching, like we saw, for instance, in some of the examples in Atlanta a few years ago. There's also been shown that there's a high correlation between test scores and the socioeconomic status of students and family that attends those schools. So maybe we're not really capturing how well the school performs, but only how much money or how much resources families have, right? But even if none of those things were a problem, there's I think a little bit less a topic that people do not pay as much attention, which is the fact that if the population that's being tested is not representative of the population that actually attends the school, then those results are also going to be skewed and less useful for all these sort of decisions that I previously mentioned. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, basically seeing what happens if this issue of non-representative arises in the context of education policy. We're not the first ones to actually look at this problem. In the US, there's extensive literature showing that there's exclusion of low performers through different kind of mechanisms, like, for instance, reclassifying low-performing students as students with disabilities in order to, again, get exemptions from that for them to take the test, or also use of disciplinary measures. If you give a kid a suspension, for instance, the day before the test, they don't show up that day, right? In the context of Chile, which is actually the context where I'm going to set up the study that I'm going to show you today, there's also been some work around this, especially from the demand side, in terms of if the results are kind of skewed in terms of representativeness, that also gives kind of distorted signals to parents in order to where to send their kids. So that also have costs associated to it. But overall, there has been less attention to seeing how these sort of non-representative patterns shift potentially the distribution overall. Okay, so that's what I'm going to focus on today. But I think that the main thing that we should have in mind is that in most of the settings around the world, schools have incentives to game the system in terms of like they have incentives to be strategic and try to maximize their performance in this sort of test in order to either get more funding or get less restrictions in use of funds, or even just avoid being closed, for example. So in high accountability settings, this topic seems to be highly relevant. So what I'm going to show you today, actually, we're going to divide this study kind of in two different parts. First, I'm going to show you kind of the magnitude of the problem. So we're going to use an event study approach and show you how these sort of exclusion patterns look like, okay? Are they the same for every type of school? Are they the same for every grade? We're going to focus specifically on the high amount of heterogeneity that seems to be present in this sort of problem. And as I mentioned before, we're going to focus beyond bottom performers. So we're going to be looking at the entire distribution, because in the context of Chile in particular, I think that that is actually pretty relevant. And I'm hopefully also going to try to convince you that other potential mechanisms that do not have to do with strategic behavior do not entirely explain the results that we find, okay? So we're going to use some like cool data that Nico was really great to get access to in order to try to rule out other potential explanations. Once I've hopefully convinced you that there is a problem and the problem is pretty large, we're going to talk a little bit about what can be done. So for this, we're going to be a little bit more propositive and try to basically predict what the attendance would look like on a regular day if the test hadn't happened. And with that, we're going to use data-driven methods to try to identify those schools that are more likely engaging in this sort of strategic behavior. And once we've been able to identify those schools, also test out the different consequences that potential imputation policies could have. And there we're going to play around with different kind of decisions that policymakers could have in terms of imputation policies. Okay, so let's get into kind of the data and the educational context of this study. Particularly, I'm going to be talking about Chile. So for those of you that are not, do not know the Chilean educational system very well, Chile basically has a universal voucher system, so it's very different from the US. We have full-on school choice, which basically means that parents can send their kids to whichever school they want. Of course, that is constrained to schools that have capacity, and also the paying capacity of parents too, because schools can charge a co-payment in order to enroll your kid there. Chile also loves testing. Big fans of testing. Since the 1980s, we have universal standardized testing for everyone, basically, in Chile. We started with fourth graders, but throughout the years, other grades have also been, this has been expanded to other grades. So right now we have actually data from kids from second grade, for instance, until 10th grade. So we have a kind of big variety of ages that are being tested. And I believe that on average, at least in the period from our data, students in their kind of school period got tested at least twice. So for instance, fourth grade and then 10th grade, or fourth grade and then 8th grade or something. The CIMSE, which is basically the standardized test that is universally taken in Chile, is actually a very high stakes test in this case. Besides the fact that is kind of the one big input that parents could take in order to, again, select schools for the students, it's tied to teacher bonuses. So depending on how the students perform is whether teacher salaries get increased or not. And very importantly also for schools that subscribe to a specific policy, which is the SEP policy, which basically means that they receive more money for vulnerable students, their performance affects how they can actually use their budget, and also potentially if their school gets closed or not. So particularly for those schools, CIMSE is a very, very high stakes test. So schools, and again, this is kind of anecdotally, but it has been shown that schools pay a lot of attention to the SIMSA and are very concerned about their performance overall and try to maximize their scores. In terms of absenteeism and how do schools and the government overall manage this sort of attendance on the day of the test, there's not much going on here. Basically, what they do is that schools give the students, in order to give their parents, pre-filled communication telling them that the SIMSA is on a specific day and the importance of them attending that test. And I'm going to show you some evidence that parents from lower income students seem to be less likely to receive this sort of information. So there is some sort of asymmetry of information depending on your socioeconomic status. But beyond that, there's really not much of a communication campaign going on. Most importantly, there are no real consequences for low attendance. Okay, there's no imputation strategy so far. So basically, if the distribution of people that take the test is very different from the population of students that are enrolled, there's really nothing happening to the school. In between 2005 and 2007, the government tried to put kind of symbols besides the test scores for those schools that had very non-representative attendance. They received a huge pushback from schools, and actually that got discontinued after 2007 because just the pressure was too much. So this is very important because, again, there's really no consequences to strategizing and kind of cherry picking a little bit who comes or not to take the test. Okay, and that's going to be important in this setup. Finally, and I'm not going to get too much into this, but there's has been some improvement in terms of regulation and what kind of students you can exclude from taking the test. So before 2012, it was pretty lax in terms of exemptions. But since 2012 onwards, there's just a very specific set of disabilities that can get exempted, for instance, from taking this test, as well as students that are non-Spanish speakers. So they limited a lot kind of the amount of exemptions that you could get, which again will play into the fact that potentially this is not the main mechanisms that are going to explain the results that I'm going to show.
Hi, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, what are the consequences for students if they don't take the test? Like, is it, if they miss school on the day of the test, do they have to take it like on a different day, or they just never have to take it, or are there any consequences that accrue to the students?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. Students have no consequences whatsoever. So this test doesn't affect them directly. It only affects them through whatever way it affects the school. Okay. And it's very important to also understand that students never actually know their scores. So the government does get, of course, individual scores for each student, but they only release them at the school level. And actually right now, they're not even including them at the school level, but that's another thing. In the period that I'm talking about, they did release the average for the school. But the student himself does not have any sort of consequence. It doesn't really affect them in any sort of way. And again, that's also going to be very important for other sort of mechanisms that I'm going to show you. So that's great. Okay, let me talk to you a little bit about basically the results and the data that we're going to be using. So we have three main sources of data here. We're going to use, of course, a standardized test between 2011 and 2018. So you can think about this as having the test scores, again, at the individual level for different subjects. For fourth grade and second grade, it's only math and language, but when the students get a little bit older, you also have history and science. And with that, also we get a socioeconomic characterization that is a parental questionnaire that parents need to complete. This is not necessarily tied to the student actually taking the test because they get the questionnaire before they take the test, right? But it's still somewhat incomplete. So we don't have actually that questionnaire for absolutely everyone in the school, but for most students overall. The second piece of data that is very important here, it's the fact that we have daily attendance. So again, one of the cool things of the setting that we're studying is that because it's a full choice system with voucher payments from the government, each school has actually has to report attendance every day. And these sort of attendance also gets spot checked at different schools kind of randomly in order to make sure that they are kind of correct. Okay. So basically for every day, we have around 2.5 million records for each student, whether they attended that day or not. And we're going to use, again, this daily attendance data in order to get the results that I'm going to show you. So again, this is kind of like very large data set. That's also very important to keep in mind. And finally, we're also going to use the GPA performance for students between 2011 and 2018, so the same period. And this is going to be relevant because we want to create kind of performance groups. We're going to divide this into deciles. So you can think about the distribution as 10 different deciles of GPA performance, where the first decile is going to be the bottom performers, the kids with kind of the lowest GPAs, and decile 10 is going to be the top performers, students with just the highest grades overall. Okay. So this is just to show you that we have a lot of data. So we have different years. Again, as I mentioned, we have between 2011 and 2018. We don't have every grade for every year because not every grade gets tested every year except for fourth grade. That's kind of the one grade that is available every year. But overall, each year we get around 5,500 schools, which is most schools in Chile. And again, a lot of students per grade overall. Okay, so let's get into the event study. This is a very straightforward event study. Nothing really too fancy about this. We're going to use the attendance of student I as kind of the outcome. And remember that we're looking at a student in a particular GPA group. So again, think about deciles of performance in a specific school S, in a grade G, and for a specific day T, okay? We're going to use a window 5 days before the test and 5 days after the test. So that's kind of the idea. So the idea is to show that there's not much going on before the test. There's not much going on after the test, kind of like as a check for this. And then on the day of the test, we're going to assess whether there is or not any sort of effect. But we're basically comparing students that are in the same school, in the same group, in the same school, in the same GPA decile, okay? So that's also kind of important. And each of these event studies only has one grade that was tested, okay? So there's only, for instance, if we were testing fourth grade, this would be like between first and fifth grade, for example, where only fourth grade was tested. And we're going to use, again, this indicator variables with leads and lags for students that belong in this tested grade to assess, again, this sort of effect in this period 5 days before and 5 days after. So let's get into some pretty plots for this. So here we can see the clear difference in attendance by performance for second grade. So this is the youngest grade that we have. In blue here, we have the top performers. As we can see, there's not much going on before the test happened. On the day of the test, we do see a spike sort of in attendance of over 2 percentage points. And then after the test, we go back to business as usual. For the bottom performance, however, the story is quite the opposite. Again, not much going on before the test. On the day of the test, their attendance drops like 6 percentage points. And again, nothing much going on a little bit after the test. Okay. So this is kind of a clear pattern of a skewed distribution where, again, top performers are attending much more than what we would expect. Bottom performers are attending much, much less. If we look at the same results, but for 10th grade, this is, again, kind of the highest grade that we have, the older students, we can see that, again, students that are in the top performing decile, they do attend more the day of the test. But there's not much going on with the bottom performers. So they do not seem to be attending less. They basically seem to be taking this test as a typical day overall, okay? And just to show you the different grades that we have, this is for 2014, but again, you can see this on other years as well. For the younger 2 grades that we have, which is second and fourth grade, you can see kind of this big gradient of attendance, where bottom performers attend much, much less, and top performers attend much more than what we would expect. But that actually softens quite a bit when we look at older grades. And actually, again, between 6th and 10th grade overall, doesn't seem to be much going on in the bottom performers, but again, the top performers do seem to be attending more. I think this is kind of relevant to show in the context of Chile because overall, unlike the US, in Chile, attendance on average increases on the day of the test. So everyone has kind of this idea that maybe this sort of exclusion patterns are not really a problem in Chile because attendance overall increases, while, for example, in the US, attendance on average decreases. However, as you can see, this hides a lot of heterogeneity depending, again, on the type of school and also on the grade that we're looking at, okay? So clearly there's something going on specifically in lower grades, and we're going to try to identify what potentially could be happening here. So let me just give you some potential mechanisms that could explain these patterns that are not necessarily the last one that I'm listing here. So we could be thinking that schools are directly just strategizing and either incentivizing or disincentivizing different parts of the distribution in order, again, to maximize their results. However, there are other sort of reasons that could get the same patterns without necessarily this gaming strategy. So students could be excluded for other reasons. As I mentioned, if they have some sort of disability and that is correlated with their performance, then this could generate those patterns. I'm not going to go too much into this, but again, exemptions are not very prominent since 2012 onwards. So even if we did not consider the exclusions, it would not kind of explain away the results that we're finding. I'm going to dive a little bit more into the other two, which is first, whether low-performing students are less aware of the test. So if that could happen, it could be the case that top performers are attending more because they're more aware of the test, right? And the third one, which is whether students experience some sort of disutility from testing. So it could be that it's not schools that are selecting students or excluding students, but students themselves that are kind of self-selecting out because they experience kind of some sort of negative experience from being tested. Okay, and again, if that is correlated with their performance, then that could explain this sort of patterns that we're seeing. So let me show you first some results about differences in communications between high and low performers. So we have access to this unpublished 2017 survey, which is basically for students that were in test-taking grades. And the idea was to try to see whether they knew about the SIMSA, whether they got prepared, whether they got any sort of incentives to perform well, and things like that. So we used that information, and as you can see, students that are in the bottom decile report that they're less likely to be told about the test and less likely to be notified, which might not be surprising because they also have just overall lower attendance. So if they're not there the day that the teacher communicated this, it is kind of natural that they are less aware of the test. While on the other hand, students in the top decile, they report actually that they were told and notified kind of in higher rates. These are the results, though, for fourth grade. And even though the kind of increasing likelihood of them being told and notified about the test is important for the top performers to increase their attendance, it doesn't necessarily explain why the bottom performers attend less. If they didn't know about the test, they should attend overall in the same rate that they would attend another sort of regular day. But they are actually decreasing, at least in fourth grade, they're decreasing their attendance. So this could explain somewhat what we see in older grades, but not necessarily in younger grades. And more interestingly, I think that when we see the same results, but instead of fourth grade for 10th grade, those difference in being told and notified actually decrease quite a bit. So again, even though this could somewhat be writing part of the results that we're seeing, it doesn't seem to be driving the whole thing. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
I'm just curious. So, do you know like what the structure is of like student course taking within schools? Like, could it be the case that in fourth grade, like low performing students are all in one class, and like high performing students are maybe in like a gifted and talented class, and so there's like sort of different ways to communicate with the different groups of students, or are they all like mixed together?
That's a great question. I think that specifically for lower grades, I don't and again, this is kind of like my own knowledge of the system. I'm not actually like, I haven't seen the data on this, but it's not very common to do tracking in Chile, at least not in lower grades, specifically before 7th grade. There's very little tracking in terms of how you sort students. So my impression is that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but my impression mainly is that there's a difference between 4th grade and or younger grades and the older grades in terms of who controls or who affects the attendance of the student the most. So you can think about lower grades as the parents being more in charge of whether the kid shows up to school or not, while in older grades is students themselves most likely who are kind of driving this sort of decision. So if schools can somehow kind of notify the parents in different ways, specifically also by telling them that the Sims is very important, and again, they need to perform well, I think it's easier for them to kind of manipulate or strategize with parents than it is to actually do it with the students themselves. And that's why that the results that we see in older grades are not the same as the ones that we see in lower grades. That's kind of the hypotheses that we're working with, but it's basically based on anecdotal experience and an experience from people that we know that has been teachers and have been kind of in this sort of position. But I think that's the main difference between older grades and younger grades, more than tracking, for example, and things like that. The other important thing, and this has been a big question, especially here in the US, where there's like a lot of kind of movements about not testing and things like that, is whether parents or students themselves are self-selecting out of being tested and not necessarily the school excluding them, right? So in this case, we use actually a no-stake test that is applied randomly to a set of schools, around 300 per year. And basically is set up the same way as SIMSA. This is basically the pilot for SIMSA. So schools have no consequences for this, but from the student point of view, it is the same thing. They go through the same process. They receive the communication, they need to come that day to school and basically spend all day kind of completing this test. And I think this is important with Ravi's question before, that remember that SIMSA has no consequence for the student themselves. So from the student point of view, this no stakes test is basically the same experience as SIMSA, right? And again, I'm not going to go through the entire table. This is basically just to show you that estimates are very small and not significant. We really don't see anything going on here. So if students really did not like being tested, for example, we should expect to see similar patterns than we saw on the high stake test that I showed you previously. So at least in part, it seems like these sort of alternative mechanisms are not able to explain fully the results that I showed you before. So we're going to assume that at least to some extent, schools are strategizing, right, and trying to quote unquote game the system in order to maximize their performance by kind of playing around with attendance on the day of the test. So clearly this is a big problem. So let's try to see if we can do something about it. So one thing that we thought about doing basically is like, okay, we have this rich panel data, right, with a lot of observations, daily attendance for years, and so forth. Can we use that to actually predict the attendance on the day of the test as if it was a regular day? So the idea of this, the advantages of this versus what I showed you previously is kind of twofold. The first one is that we don't, if we want to kind of do this sort of prediction, we could potentially identify schools that we could potentially identify what we would expect attendance to look like on the day of the test, even before the test happens, right? And that could give also kind of tools to the policymakers or the government to kind of act beforehand in order to address this issue. We're going to be using screen gradient boosting for this. With this panel data, we're going to use basically kind of lags of attendance overall in order to, again, set up the structure for this problem. We're going to be using the fact that days of the week, again, have different attendance patterns, their grade, their GPA group. We also have siblings attendance, which, again, could be an important predictor of attendance itself. And we also have a lot of other student characteristics and school characteristics that could come into play. I'm going to show you some results for fourth grade in this case, and we're going to be using kind of a panel of schools and students between first and fifth grade in the metropolitan region. This is just because of like capacity constraints of the size of the data in order to show you this. But we've tried it also with other regions in the country, and it basically works in a very similar way. So as I mentioned, we're going to use all the data before the test to kind of forecast or predict the attendance on the day of the test. So let me show you some results on this. So let me show you first the non-tested grade. So in blue here, you can see our predictions, right? And in green, you can see actually the observed attendance. This is basically divided by deciles. We just merged the middle deciles for just simplicity. So the middle is the third to the eighth decile. And just on the bottom panel, just for, again, clarity of exposure, that's just the difference in means between the observed and the predicted attendance in terms of percentage points. So you can see kind of the difference. We do a pretty good job at predicting overall attendance by decile. So you can see actually that on average, there's really not a substantial difference. But when we look at the tested grade, this kind of replicates what I already showed you with the event study, which again, is not really that surprising. We predict that attendance in the lower, in the bottom deciles is actually higher than what we actually observe. And the opposite is true for kind of the top deciles. So you can see that actually observed attendance is higher than what we would predict. So again, this is kind of like a sanity check overall that these results are at least are matching to our previous identification strategy. But I think that the cool thing about this is that we can actually dive in now into specific schools. So let me just quickly show you this as an example, these two different schools. So I just picked two schools that basically look the same, for example, from a parent's perspective. So if you're a parent, you see school one, they have kind of average scores, 258 and 260 in math and language, respectively. And school two looks very similar, 259 and 256 in math and language. So if I didn't know anything, these two schools seem to perform fairly the same. But let's look now at kind of their attendance distributions on the day of the test. So on the left panel, we have school one. On the right panel, we have school two. On the first row, we have a non-tested grade. And on the bottom row, we have the tested grade. So let's focus first on school one. As you can see, both the non-tested and the tested grades doesn't really seem to be a very precise pattern of differences between what we predict and what we observe. Of course, there is some noise, and it is to be expected. But again, there doesn't seem to be a very clear pattern of these differences, right? On school two, on the other hand, if we look at the non-tested grade, which is again the right upper plot there, we seem to do a good job in terms of predicting that attendance by decile. But the story is quite different when we look at the tested grade, when there's kind of a huge difference for that first decile. We would expect it to have around an 85, 86% of attendance. However, it's kind of around the 50s. So this is kind of an extreme example, but this is kind of the idea of what we're looking at. There are some schools that, even though, again, prediction is not necessarily perfect, the attendance patterns do not seem to create any sort of narrative. While in school two, I would say that that is a school that probably is more likely to be adopting any sort of strategic behavior.
Can I ask one quick question about your models? Do they include the potential reasons for exclusion, like disability status? Like, could it be the case that school two, there's a lot of students who are getting legitimate exclusions that just happen to be sort of clustered in school two and in the lowest decile?
That's a great question. We do not. Oh, sorry. We're not including that, but I believe that we can get that. I believe that we can get that data, like a percentage of students with registered disabilities or something. Yeah. I think that we should be able to get that. But as I mentioned before, even the disabilities that are allowed to be exempted are very narrow since 2012 onwards. So again, it's like blindness or things like that. Like it's pretty extreme what students need to do in order to get this. And unlike I think that the US, students usually that have more severe disabilities go to other specific schools that are designed with programs that attend to those needs instead of being inserted in kind of more in kind of traditional regular schools, which is the ones that we're looking at here. But I definitely think that we can get kind of the percentage of students with disabilities or some sort of proxy of that in order to add it. So that's a great suggestion. Thank you. Sorry. Awesome. Okay, so we have the prediction at the school level, and now we want to try to characterize this in a data-driven way, so we don't have to like subjectively, quote unquote, try to pick out those schools that are kind of strategizing. So we do a K-mean clusterings in this case, using again the difference between the predicted and the observed attendance in order to see how many clusters kind of optimally are created, and then try to characterize those different groups depending on their characteristics. So we actually find two optimal clusters, and let me just quickly show you the differences between the observed attendance and the predicted attendance. So the first cluster, which is here in purple, actually overall in all their deciles, they on average show kind of a slightly higher attendance overall. So you can think about these are being kind of the ideal schools. Overall, it seems that their attendance is increasing to what we would expect, and again, all throughout the distribution. So that's great. On cluster 2, on the other hand, these are more likely to be consistent with this strategic behavior sort of engagement. We can see that on the bottom deciles, students attend much less on average, right? While at the top deciles, there doesn't seem to be much going on, okay? So again, this sort of average behavior is more consistent with this gaming strategy that I previously mentioned. So I'm going to treat cluster 1 as kind of non-gaming schools and cluster 2 as this kind of strategic behavior schools. In terms of how we characterize these different schools, here I'm showing you the difference between the gaming and the non-gaming schools. So on average, we can see that this quote unquote strategic schools are more likely to be more vulnerable or serve a more vulnerable population. They're more likely to be public schools. They're more likely to have a higher percentage of priority students, which are basically the bottom of the socioeconomic distribution in terms of income. And also, maybe not surprisingly, they tend to also perform worse. Okay, this is also going to be interesting because remember that if cluster 2 is gaming this and they're still performing worse than cluster 1, if we try to correct this, that difference might actually increase and will probably increase. Okay, and this just shows the differences between the expected, the observed prediction and the observed and the predicted attendance, and the difference between both clusters. So you can see that clearly cluster 2, the bottom deciles attend much less. Okay, this is just showing you the same thing, but with the numbers. Okay, great. See how I'm doing on time. Okay, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about imputation policies to see how we can realign now the incentives for schools and the incentives for policymakers. Because right now, clearly, the main problem that we're having is that they're misaligned. So schools kind of have an incentive to be strategic and kind of game the system, while policymakers hopefully want to just test everyone and get the results for all the students that attend the school. So one typical thing that is done in order to handle this absenteeism problem is basically to impute scores. And impute scores that are usually lower than what you would expect if the student showed up, in order, again, to be kind of penalizing an absence, okay? So we can think about different setups where we have no imputation, which is the status quo right now. We can impute for attendance that like as a typical day, like if the test hadn't happened, or more harshly if we could impute everyone that just was absent that day. And as I mentioned, the proposal is to impute the lowest score for absent students is to disincentivize this arbitrary exclusion. And you can think that you can play around basically with what is the lowest score. Okay, so I'm going to show you some results for that. The most important thing to keep in mind here, however, is that we want to do something that realigns kind of the incentives for policymakers and schools, but without overly penalizing schools that just overall are more vulnerable because they do have higher absenteeism rates overall, even on a typical day. So we don't want to over punish them because that again will increase inequality and potentially non-representativeness of how students move between different schools. Okay. So we're trying to balance kind of these two things. So I'm going to show you three scenarios. Scenario one is no imputation at all. You can think about this as the status quo right now that we have set up in Chile. Scenario two, we're going to impute by decile, only again by the difference between the predicted and the observed attendance. And I'm going to play around a little bit about the harshness of what the minimum score is. And in scenario three, I'm just going to impute every missing student, and I'm going to impute just overall the minimum score for all students in Chile. Very important caveats here. The difference again between the predicted and observed captures the total incentives and disincentives in attendance. So it means that some students can be disincentivized in that decile, while others might be incentivized. I'm not able to disentangle both, so just the overall difference is going to be capturing those two things. We do think that in specific deciles, there's clearly one kind of dominant strategy. So that's what this is going to be capturing. And the second thing that is important is that the imputed score, in some cases, might be too optimistic. The real score could be potentially lower than what we observed in the distribution. In that case, if the policymakers wants to, they could actually impute the minimum minus a delta or something in order to make it harsher. Great. So these are the first two scenarios, kind of scenario one and scenario three. Scenario one is kind of the more lenient one where nothing is happening. You can see that there's a 6.6 point difference between these two sort of clusters, gaming schools and non-gaming schools. And if we impute everyone, that difference actually increases and triples overall. So it's a very big difference on average if we impute everyone that was not present that day. That again might be overly harsh because remember that this sort of strategic schools are serving a more vulnerable population. Okay, so then we can play around with this and basically just impute again as if this was a typical day. I'm playing around with the actual score that we impute. It basically creates different gaps between those two distributions. So it depends basically on where we want to land over. But again, that gap is always going to increase in this case because the gaming schools are not actually being a good representative of what their scores should be. Great. Let me just wrap up with some conclusions and next steps for this project. So hopefully I've convinced you that there are some clear non-representative patterns of absenteeism that goes beyond actual exclusion of low performers, which in the case of Chile might be very important because they could be masking these kind of problems of a skewed distribution. There seems to be also very high heterogeneity between schools. I don't think I mentioned it, but basically what we find is that around 25 or 30% of schools seem to be engaged in this sort of strategic behavior, while most of them are not, right? So probably 70% of them are fine and might not be a huge problem, but clearly there's a set of schools that we should be looking more into, right? And the identification of this sort of gaming schools is particularly important. So we can think that instead of just looking at 1 year, we can also look at persistence of these schools and see whether they're repeatedly doing this in order, again, to be more confident about the results that we get. Even though communication doesn't seem to explain away everything that we find, we do think that communication strategies do play a very important role, especially, again, for low-performing students, especially if it can be something that goes directly from the government to the household instead of going through the school, right? The school has incentives, again, to send different messages, as we saw in the data. So if we could somehow just get the message directly from the policymaker to the household, that might somewhat alleviate kind of this sort of strategic behavior, or just try to minimize it a little bit. And finally, more importantly, this is kind of a work in progress, but the impact of imputation policies can actually be very large. So we do need to think about how to handle this in an optimal way, while trying to, again, realign these sort of incentives and don't make it costly for a student to actually miss school from the school standpoint. Okay, but at the same time, being very careful of not overly penalizing those schools that just overall have higher absenteeism rates. And basically, there is where a lot of decisions could come in, like what scores do we impute for whom, and so forth. But I think that there's a lot of area that a lot of space for things that can be done in order to improve and better the current strategies that we have, in order to, again, make the tests useful from a policy standpoint, but at the same time, make them also fair from the school standpoint. Thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to talk to you about it.
So first, I'm going to just thank you on behalf of everybody for a super interesting talk. And yeah, open it up to questions. I know we have a few students on this call, so as usual, I'd like to sort of particularly encourage you to ask any questions if you have them. But otherwise, yeah.
I've got a question if you're good, Robbie. Sorry, I'm having internet. My internet's doing a little weird stuff. New York State in particular has a big opt-out movement, and I don't know what the status of it is now. I want to say, I don't remember exactly when this was. This was several years ago. We were asked to when Howard Everson was, before he retired, we were asked to like make remarks on it. And I remember coming up with a model, and it ended up being a model that someone else had invented, like everything else, right? You know, it's like, you know how it goes. That where we were trying to model individual level, like the effect on the distribution of the individual level decisions to opt out, and ended up abandoning it because we couldn't get data. New York State wasn't going to give us anything, and you know, it's like they don't want to know. The people who nobody wants to know anything. So I think the model itself, when we were just toying around with it, it was just like starting with essentially like a logistic regression and then trying to thin the tails out depending on propensity to drop or not, to opt or not, and what would happen to the overall ability distribution. And it was kind of interesting. It kind of did a lot of what you were saying, which is, you know, if you have lots of people opting at the high end, it squishes the tails in different ways. So it's really cool that you've actually been able to have data to show this, because it all made sense. But, you know, like I said, New York State was certainly not going to give us the data to do this, because not at that point anyway. Cuomo was a real jerk about that kind of thing, to say the least. So no, it's really interesting that you've been able to actually you know, show that you know, that actually happened, you know, exactly what you think it happens. And it's more complicated than, you know, any sort of simple thing would suggest. So I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I really wanted to say it's really important that you're doing this kind of work, because especially what policy is right, we don't know, you know. Yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah. I think that the main comment that I get a lot is like, this is basically not possible to do in the US because daily attendance data is very hard to come by, especially like at a bigger level. We've been able to get some kind of daily attendance data, and even like at the how do you call it, at the time period sort of data, but just for specific school districts. So we're trying to see if we can gather a bunch or something like that in order to test something like that here. But it's clearly much more of a
hard.
a
Yeah.
challenge.
There's an extraordinary amount of data gaming that goes on. So that the education system talks about how they want to be data driven, but they all know they're getting judged by it. So it's literally just Campbell's law in absolute action. You can sell, they all know they're getting judged. They all game it. Because and they don't have unified systems to keep track of it. So of course, how would you be able to, how can anyone even do it legitimately anyway? So they have the time a lot of, no, yeah, it's a real problem. The hyper local US education system makes doing a lot of this kind of work actually essentially impossible. Even New York City, which seems like it's actually a unified district, is totally not.
Other questions? Okay, I'm gonna ask. I have lots of questions. I because I think this is really cool work. So one question that occurred to me is, in the cases in the U.S. That I feel like I've heard about anecdotally, right? There's, you hear about maybe sort of differential exclusion, but also just simply gaming the scores. And I'm curious if you see or are able to look at, it's not clear to me exactly how one might do that, but do you think there's any way that you could see whether or not schools or teachers are just like directly manipulating scores rather than doing it in this kind of indirect way by, potentially strategically excluding people in lower deciles?
Do you mean like influencing scores directly, like what happened in Atlanta, like directly like cheating,
Literally,
or
yeah. Yeah, like
okay,
going in and especially because the students are not gonna, they don't know their own scores, right? So it's not like somebody could
yeah.
say, well, I knew I got half the questions wrong, but you gave me 100. But I mean, I guess I'm just sort of wondering if there's any way in the data that you might be able to also see evidence of like, intentional manipulation in the scores.
That's a good question. I don't think that we can see it on the data, but I can tell you a little bit about how testing happens in Chile. So it's a pretty kind of solemn thing. Actually, external examiners come to each school basically, and teachers or other sort of staff in the school do not have contact with the students that are being tested. So everything's done kind of externally. So I remember when I took this test, basically they kind of close off like a part of the school, right? You go into the school, into your classroom, and there's one like outside examiner that basically makes you take a test, whatever. You spend like most of the day there with those sort of examiners, and then they leave with a kind of test. So at least to my knowledge, and again, I might be wrong, but to my knowledge, there doesn't seem to be a lot of space for teachers or staff to directly affect those scores, right? Because they make it a point for them not to have contact with the students while this is happening.
Thanks. Yeah, that's super useful to know. Other questions? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. Jennifer, there we go.
Yeah. So, I mean, another thing that happens in the U.S. is teaching to the test. And you see this differentially in like the high stakes years, which so it's a different kind of incentive system. And so sometimes you'll see like a pile up right on either side. Do you see, of certain thresholds? Do you see any evidence of things like that in the data?
We haven't combined this, but we do have with this sort of with the survey that I showed you about students being notified and told. I didn't specifically focus on this column, but we do or the government does ask students whether they got specifically prepared for the test, right? So you can think that schools do like a SIMSA preparation, and some sort of days, and they could use like previous tests and things like that to explicitly kind of teach to the test. We haven't done much in terms of combining schools that seem to be doing this more with their scores and see what's going on there. But that's definitely something that we could look at. Because at least from the student perspective, we do have the reports of whether they got directly prepared for that test. which I think it's
sometimes even just targeting the people who are right at a threshold, or but anyway. Great. Wonderful talk. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna ask another question, which is I was wondering, so I don't really know anything about this area, so maybe this is like a super naive question, but I guess it seems like it would make sense to me that if you have like some subgroups of a population that are sort of underrepresented or overrepresented relative to kind of what they should be on the day of the test, that like a simple thing to do would just be to sort of upweight the students, upweight the scores of the decile one students who are slightly underrepresented, and maybe downweight the scores of the decile 10 students who are slightly overrepresented. And I'm wondering if is that like a sort of reasonable thing to do? Is that going to be effectively the same as one of the imputation strategies? Like, if parents just want to know like what's the sort of like actual actual score, then why not just do some kind of like simple reweighting?
No, that's actually a great question. And this is actually a question that I got one time before. And I think that it would actually be very useful because we also have a lot of data. So we could do some sort of kind of prediction sort of thing in order to try to predict what the score would be for a student that didn't show up that day, right? We have a lot of their scores, things like that, which I think would create a similar thing to what you're saying of kind of reweighting this sort of distribution. I think that might be very useful for in terms of like parents or things like that to provide that information, right? The imputation strategy, however, and I think that this is a little bit controversial, but it doesn't necessarily want to replicate what the score would be if the student kind of showed up, but it actually wants to make it a little bit worse if the student doesn't show up, so that for the school point of view, it is costly for that student to be absent. So it doesn't necessarily show the true score, which again could be a problem in terms of what we're using this for, maybe, right? But it kind of realigns this sort of incentive. And the idea is that if there is an imputation strategy in place, the ideal scenario was that we don't need to use it because basically the students will start showing up, right? So there's like I think a really cool kind of difference between both. I think both of them are useful. They're useful for kind of different things, right? If we're going to make decisions in terms of funding or in terms of like providing this score for parents, I think it would be very useful to actually get the distribution that we would observe on a typical day. In terms of, again, trying to disincentivize absenteeism, maybe the sort of penalizing might work better, right?
Great. Well, we're at time, so I'm gonna thank you again, Magdalena, on behalf of all of us for a wonderful and engaging talk. And thanks everybody for attending. We have a couple more talks this semester, and we hope to see you there. And Magdalena, I hope we see you when you're in town next. Please come by.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. This was great, and thank you for all the comments.